Pacifica Radio, I'm Christina Onnested. President Joe Biden joined European leaders in France today to mark the 80th anniversary of the D-Day invasion in Normandy. It was the beginning of the end of World War II and Adolf Hitler's Nazi Holocaust that killed some 6 million Jews. Biden today invoked the Ukraine war as another front against tyranny.
The struggle between a dictatorship and freedom is unending. Here in Europe, we see one stark example. Ukraine has been invaded by a tyrant bent on domination. Ukrainians are fighting with extraordinary courage, suffering great losses, but never backing down. The United States and NATO and a coalition of more than 50 countries standing strong with Ukraine. We will not walk away.
Meanwhile, Russia's President Vladimir Putin warned Wednesday he could provide long-range weapons to others to strike Western targets in response to NATO allies allowing Ukraine to use their arms to attack Russian territory. Putin also reaffirmed Moscow's readiness to use nuclear weapons if it sees a threat to its sovereignty. An Israeli strike hit a United Nations school sheltering displaced Palestinians in central Gaza early today, killing at least 35 people, including 14 children and 9 women, according to the United Nations, which said the strike occurred without notice against international humanitarian law. The Israeli military said Hamas militants were operating from within the school. Dozens were taken to Al-Aqsa Hospital after the strike. Karen Huster with Doctors Without Borders posted this video from the hospital.
We have seen hospitals being bombed. We have seen refugee camps being bombed. We have seen humanitarian warehouses being bombed. The situation is apocalyptic. This morning on my way to the hospital, I saw 2 donkeys carrying the bodies of at least 8 people who had died in the hostilities of the last night.
Another strike on a house overnight killed 6 Palestinians, and all Gaza's health ministry says Israeli strikes have killed 68 people in the last 24 hours, wounded 235 others. Global average temperatures for last May shattered historic records, and the same has been true for every month for the last year, according to a report by the European Union's Copernicus Weather Agency. This is United Nations Secretary General Guterres called for attacks on oil companies and more. Christopher Martinez reports.
The report on hottest months was one of 3 major climate reports released the same day. Another says the world is close to 5 long-term tipping points, including melting glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica that could raise sea levels, and melting Arctic permafrost that could release massive amounts of methane, a potent greenhouse gas. The third report says in the next few years, the world is likely to overshoot the goal of limiting rising temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres says every fraction of a degree counts.
The difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees could be the difference between extinction and survival for some small island states and coastal communities.
He had 33 calls to action. Many of them had to do with the fossil fuel industry, a group he calls godfathers of climate chaos.
I call on these companies to stop acting as enablers of planetary destruction.
He calls for countries to ban advertising from fossil fuel companies. And to fossil fuel executives, he says their massive profits mean they can lead the energy transition. Reporting for Pacifica Radio News KPFA, I'm Christopher Martinez.
An appeals court has halted the Georgia election interference case against former President Donald Trump and others while it reviews a lower court judge's ruling that allow Fulton County District Attorney Fannie Willis to remain on the case. The Georgia Court of Appeals Wednesday issued the order that prevents Superior Court Judge Scott McAfee from moving forward with pretrial motions while the appeal from Trump's legal team is pending. The decision makes it more likely the prosecution of Donald Trump for trying to overturn Georgia's election results will not go to trial before the November general election. Chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, is calling for a Senate probe into Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito and potential conflicts of interest after his homes were seen waving two flags connected to the MAGA Stop the Steal movement to overturn Donald Trump's 2020 presidential election loss. A case related to the issue is before the nation's high court.
The court is rapidly losing its legitimacy and the American people's trust. These scandals and the subsequent refusal of these involved justices to recuse themselves from cases involving Donald Trump and the January 6th insurrection are unfortunately not surprising.
She joined Georgia Representative Democrat Hank Johnson in calling for passage of legislation that would create an enforceable ethics standards for justices.
This is a court that is out of control. It's a court that needs to be reined in. We can also pass legislation, the CERT Act, Supreme Court Ethics, Recusal, and Transparency Act, which would put forth a code of conduct that would bind this court, along with an enforcement mechanism to make sure that that code of conduct was adhered to.
They note a year ago, lawmakers passed a new ethics standards amidst reports of right-wing justices like Clarence Thomas receiving lavish gifts by billionaires who had interest before the court, but those standards have no teeth. Meanwhile, reports are surfacing that the fossil fuel industry and billionaires with links to Supreme Court justices like Clarence Thomas are launching a pressure campaign to convince Supreme Court justices to side with the fossil fuel industry and strike down dozens of lawsuits filed by cities, states, and counties seeking to hold the industry accountable for climate change. The Supreme Court is scheduled to meet today to discuss whether to take up the oil industry's request to dismiss dozens of lawsuits. I'm Christina Onnested reporting for Pacifica Radio.